Zora Matthews stared at her reflection in the mirror of the spacious home she and Darius had purchased several years ago. She and Darius had been married for 8 years, and it seemed like everything was perfect. Successful careers, a cozy home, and a stable relationship. But something had changed. The warm evening in Denver brought no relief, and with each passing day, a growing sense of anxiety consumed her. Over the past month, Darius had started coming home late from work. Every evening he would call, claiming he had more meetings, projects that required his attention, or corporate dinners. She used to trust him completely, but now something was gnawing at her. The phone calls had become too frequent, and he always kept his phone out of her reach when he was near her. It was a typical Monday. Darius left early for work, not even having time to have breakfast with her. Zora had the whole day to herself and decided to spend it calmly at home. But her mind wouldn't rest. She thought back to how Darius had changed, spending more time away, avoiding conversations, and when he did speak to her, his tone was distant and cold. By the evening, Zora noticed Darius was late again. At 8 p.m., the phone rang. He was at a meeting with colleagues. Zora traced her fingers along the window pane, staring at the empty driveway. Her heart tightened with a sudden wave of suspicion. He had been disappearing too often, spending too much time away from home. A week later, Darius left early again, and Zora decided to confront one of his colleagues to see if he really had so much work. She spoke with Jessica, one of Darius's co-workers. Jessica seemed surprised by Zora's questions and simply shrugged. "Yes, we have a lot of projects, but I'm not sure Darius is as busy as he says." Those words haunted her. That same evening, Zora noticed another troubling detail. Darius had left his phone on the couch when he went to the kitchen for a glass of water. Usually he never left it in plain sight, always keeping it close. A strong urge to check his phone surged through her for a moment, but she hesitated. Memories of the past often visited Zora, especially when Asia was around. Zora's relationship with her cousin had always been complicated. Since childhood, from the moment they grew up together, Zora felt that Asia was always the center of attention. At every family gathering, Asia became the favorite. Her smile and charm captivated everyone, while Zora remained in the shadows. These hidden yet deep-seated childhood jealousies eventually seeped into her adult life. She couldn't even explain it to herself, but every time Asia visited their home, Zora felt an increasing unease. Asia seemed too friendly with Darius, stopping by for dinner or tea far too often. And each time Asia left, Zora felt as if an invisible shadow lingered between her and her husband. That day, Zora finally allowed herself to voice her suspicions. Darius was late from work again. Asia had come over unexpectedly, without any prior notice, and spent several hours with Zora, but seemed distracted the entire time. When Zora mentioned that Darius was late again, Asia quickly changed the subject, as if avoiding the topic. Their conversation was superficial, but something about it was off. Something Zora hadn't noticed before, an underlying tension in her cousin's behavior. Zora chose not to confront her suspicions directly, but the unease continued to torment her. She increasingly found herself reflecting on scenes from the past, where Asia always sought attention and manipulated people around her. It began to seem to Zora that these weren't just childhood memories, but part of something more dangerous, hidden beneath the surface of their current relationship. As June progressed, Zora's suspicions grew stronger with each passing day. She watched Darius's every move, and every word he spoke seemed like a hidden lie. Asia still visited their home frequently, but Zora could no longer handle her presence calmly. The ghosts of the past began to intertwine with her present, and the tension between Zora and Asia grew, like a storm brewing on the horizon. The story seemed to be repeating itself, but this time the consequences could be far more destructive. Zora increasingly noticed troubling changes in Darius's behavior. Their marriage, once built on trust, now felt like a dam on the verge of bursting. Each day the silence between them deepened, and she began to sense that Darius was hiding something more than just work fatigue. One evening, Darius came home later than usual, once again claiming he had a meeting with colleagues. But this time, something in his demeanor made Zora tense. As he entered the house, she caught a faint whiff of women's perfume, one she hadn't noticed before. It wasn't her usual scent, and this small detail only heightened her suspicions. "Where were you?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm. "I told you we had a meeting." His response came too quickly, too mechanically. A wave of fear and distrust welled up inside Zora. She knew he was lying, but had no proof. And for the first time, she began to suspect that someone close to her, her cousin Asia, was involved. This time, Asia stopped by unannounced. She entered the house with her usual smile and flawless appearance, which always irritated Zora. Darius was home, and his face changed the moment he saw Asia. It was so obvious that Zora felt something snap inside her. The evening passed in tense silence. The glances exchanged between Darius and Asia seemed to say more than their words. After Asia left, Zora decided to finally confront the truth. "What's going on between you two?" she asked sharply, feeling that her suspicions were about to collapse under the weight of certainty. "You're crazy! She's your cousin!" Darius snapped, standing up and heading for the door, avoiding a direct answer. Days passed in cold silence. Zora tried to hold on, but her inner world was crumbling. She increasingly began to doubt her mental stability. It seemed to her that Asia was constantly present in their home, even when she wasn't there. Zora began seeing shadows and hearing faint voices, as if Asia was somewhere nearby, watching her. These scenes unfolded late at night when Zora was alone while Darius was working late again. One day, everything became even clearer. Asia called Zora in the morning to suggest they meet. Their conversation was brief, but something about it felt strange. Zora sensed that Asia was speaking in riddles, leaving hints that she couldn't quite grasp. Zora decided not to respond to the suggestion, but spent the entire morning wondering what was behind that call. Later, when Darius returned home, he once again avoided her questions. Zora, overwhelmed with panic, began watching his every move. She decided she couldn't hold back any longer and followed him. Zora received a call from a friend who had seen Darius at a cafe across town. He wasn't alone. Asia was with him. This message shocked Zora, but at the same time confirmed her worst fears. She knew her suspicions were justified. At that moment, something inside her broke, and her struggle with reality became even harder. She could no longer distinguish between what was real and what was in her imagination. The shadows of Asia continued to haunt her in the house. She could feel her cousin's presence, even if Asia was far away. Paranoia consumed her completely. The situation reached a critical point. Asia arrived at their house one evening while Darius was at another meeting. Zora opened the door and felt a surge of panic. Everything inside her boiled with tension, and it seemed like the walls of the house were closing in on her. Asia, as always, looked impeccable, but there was something new in her eyes, a cold, controlling gaze. "Zora, you need to rest. You look tired," Asia said softly, placing a hand on Zora's shoulder. But those words only fueled Zora's fear. She began to realize that Asia wasn't just manipulating her husband, but her as well. Everything that had happened over the past few weeks seemed like a carefully orchestrated game, in which Zora was merely a pawn. She understood that what she had experienced wasn't just her imagination. Asia had deliberately intruded into their lives to destroy their marriage and Zora's sanity. Zora decided to take drastic measures. She installed surveillance software on her computer to track Darius's and Asia's phone calls. Her obsession had grown so strong that she couldn't stop. She felt she was on the verge of uncovering something terrible, but she wasn't sure if she could handle the truth. This period marked the climax of Zora's internal struggle. Her mind, consumed by paranoia and the constant feeling of Asia's presence, could no longer trust itself or anyone around her. And at that moment she realized that Asia's games were far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. The morning started like any other. The residents of the quiet Denver neighborhood went about their daily routines, unaware of the shocking discovery that would soon shake the entire city. Around 8 a.m., a local farmer, checking on his livestock near the swamps on the outskirts of town, stumbled upon a strange figure half buried in the mud. At first he thought it was trash or a mannequin, but as he approached, he saw legs and hair, half submerged in the muck. It was a woman. The police arrived 30 minutes after the call. Aisha King's body was found in the swamps. Her face disfigured, her clothes covered in mud, and strangulation marks visible on her neck. The location seemed isolated and hard to reach, as if the killer had deliberately chosen it to hide the evidence. The police immediately began examining the crime scene, collecting the first clues. The next morning, Detective Cale Brown, a seasoned investigator from Denver, took over the case. The crime appeared to be professionally orchestrated. The killer had tried to conceal the evidence, and the body had clearly been moved post-mortem. Brown quickly realized that this wasn't a simple, random killing. There was something deeply personal about this case. They began the investigation with Aisha's closest connections. The first leads pointed to Darius Matthews, her cousin Zora's husband. Initially, it seemed like a straightforward case of an affair turned violent, but things turned out to be far more complicated. Phone records showed that Darius and Asia had been in frequent contact over the past few months. The messages between them appeared suspiciously close, with some clearly hinting at intimate meetings. Detective Brown summoned Darius for the first interrogation. Darius Matthews sat across from Detective Brown. His face reflected tension, but he tried to remain calm. When asked about his connection with Asia, he denied everything. "There was nothing between me and Asia," he stated confidently. "She was my wife's cousin, and we just talked." Brown closely observed his reactions. Darius seemed nervous, but showed no obvious signs of lying. Still, the detective knew something didn't add up. The phone messages clearly indicated more than just a familial relationship. Meanwhile, the autopsy results confirmed the cause of death: strangulation. Aisha's body showed signs of a struggle, but nothing that indicated the use of a weapon. The only notable clue was the presence of a strange material under Aisha's nails: fine sand and clay that didn't match the swampy area where her body was found. This indicated she had been killed elsewhere and later moved to the swamps. The investigation shifted to Aisha's final day. Detective Brown meticulously examined her movements, meetings, calls, and messages. One more detail caught his attention: a series of mysterious bank transfers Aisha had been receiving in recent months. The funds came from various accounts, pointing to a complex network of operations, possibly linked to criminal activity. As they delved deeper into Asia's financial records and emails, the police discovered that Asia had been leading a double life. In addition to her job, she had been involved in a shady real estate business. She was making dubious deals, deceiving her clients by selling them land that legally couldn't be sold. Detective Brown began to suspect that her murder might be tied to these illegal activities. This added even more intrigue to the case. Aisha might have been in danger not only due to her personal relationships, but also because of her illicit dealings. Questions arose about how much Darius knew about her affairs. Was he just a lover caught in her manipulations, or did he know more than he was admitting? The investigation intensified around Aisha's finances. Another name came up: Lance Milton, a man who appeared regularly in her phone records. Lance was a businessman involved in a construction company, but had a criminal history related to fraud. The police started questioning him in connection with the case. Lance had been linked to some of the same deals that had gotten Aisha into trouble. Meanwhile, Zora, upon learning of her cousin's death, was in shock, but deep down, she sensed this wasn't an accident. She began recalling everything that had happened in recent months, and those memories pushed her to realize that her own life wasn't as she had imagined. The police found a new clue: traces of fabric on Aisha's body that didn't match her clothing or the surrounding area. These fibers might have come from the vehicle used to transport her to the swamps. At the same time, an analysis of the sand and clay under her nails revealed that they matched a construction site outside the city, one connected to Lance Milton's company. Lance, who was questioned the next day, denied any involvement, but his alibi for the night of the murder was weak. He claimed he was meeting with clients, but no one could confirm his story. The investigation now focused on three figures: Darius, Lance, and Asia's shadowy dealings. All of them seemed implicated, but there wasn't enough evidence to charge any one person. However, Detective Brown felt the threads of this tangled case were beginning to come together. The mystery of Aisha King's murder proved far more complex than anyone had anticipated. Her double life, criminal ties, and complicated relationships with Darius and Lance made the investigation even more challenging, leaving many questions unanswered. The investigation gained momentum. Detective Cale Brown, now an experienced investigator, began to suspect that the case was much more complicated than a simple affair turned violent. He gathered new evidence, determined to unravel this tangled web. After discovering Asia's criminal connections and the mysterious Lance Milton, Brown knew they needed to dig deeper. That day, Brown discovered that Darius was the last person to see Asia alive. Their phone calls and messages abruptly ended on the night she disappeared. Darius claimed the last time he saw her was several days prior, but phone records suggested otherwise. They had communicated just hours before her death. This revelation deepened the suspicion against Darius. Even more troubling was the fact that his alibi for the day of the murder turned out to be false. Brown and his team carefully reviewed Darius's alibi. He claimed to have been at a business meeting, but none of his colleagues could confirm his presence. Moreover, surveillance cameras at the restaurant parking lot where the meeting supposedly took place didn't capture his vehicle. This was a serious breach. Darius had deliberately lied to the investigators. Detective Brown called Darius in for another interrogation. When questioned again about the night Asia disappeared, Darius grew nervous and tried to dodge the questions. But under pressure, he admitted that he had met with her that evening. This confession marked a turning point in the investigation, but it still didn't explain what happened after their meeting. Following this admission, the investigators delved deeper into Lance Milton's affairs. Brown discovered that Lance wasn't just a businessman involved in shady deals, but had a criminal past. At the age of 25, he had been convicted of fraud and breach of trust, having organized a financial scam involving fraudulent real estate investments. This revelation added a new layer of complexity to the case, as Lance was operating in the same business field as Asia. She may have been a part of his schemes, but perhaps got too involved and became a threat to him. Lance also had a strong motive: jealousy and the possibility of being exposed by Asia. It became increasingly difficult for the detectives to separate truth from lies. Cale Brown decided to interrogate Lance Milton again, this time focusing on his past. The questions centered around his relationship with Atia and their business dealings. Lance tried to maintain his composure, but the details of his alibi began to unravel. Brown couldn't find any proof that Lance had been at the location he claimed on the night of the murder. Furthermore, documents stored on Asia's computer indicated she had been planning to end her partnership with Lance and cut all ties with him. In emails the police found in her inbox, there were hints of business conflicts, further intensifying Lance's motive. Lance had been close to Asia not only as a lover, but also as a business partner. And now it became clear to the investigation that their connections ran deeper than just personal relationships. Both of them were involved in illegal real estate operations, but Lance had more reasons to eliminate Asia if she planned to betray or expose him. The detectives began untangling the entire web of Asia and Lance's criminal connections. They discovered that hundreds of thousands of dollars had passed through their hands, and some of that money had disappeared shortly before Asia's death. Additionally, other members of the criminal network may have wanted her dead if she had been planning to reveal the full extent of their illegal dealings. Detective Brown began to suspect that the murder was not just an act of jealousy or personal revenge, but a carefully orchestrated operation to prevent the exposure of a criminal enterprise. The detectives also learned that Lance knew about Asia's affair with Darius. In his testimony, Lance admitted that he found out about the affair only a few weeks before Asia's death. He didn't hide his jealousy, but denied ever threatening her with physical harm. However, the tone of the messages between them, which the investigators managed to recover, suggested their relationship had become increasingly tense. New information shifted the focus of the investigation. Brown found a witness who claimed to have seen Lance near the swamps on the day Asia disappeared. This witness was a worker at a nearby construction site and noticed a car matching the description of Lance's vehicle. This gave the police additional grounds to detain Milton for further questioning. Under pressure, Lance began to falter in his testimony. His confidence started to crumble, but there still wasn't enough direct evidence to arrest him. As the investigators continued to dig into Lance's past, more details about his dark dealings began to surface. It turned out that he had previously been involved in a series of crimes involving threats and physical violence against business partners. Brown began to suspect that Milton was far more dangerous than initially thought. He was willing to go to any lengths to protect his power and money, and Asia could have become his victim, because of her plans to break ties with him. Now the detectives were faced with a choice. They had two main suspects, Darius, whose alibi had been proven false, and who was clearly lying about his relationship with Aisha, and Lance, a man with a criminal past and a motive to eliminate her as a threat. The only question remaining was who played the key role in the murder of Aisha King. Nearly a month had passed since Aisha King's body was found in the swamps outside Denver. The investigation was moving slowly, shrouding everyone in an atmosphere of uncertainty and fear. The police questioned both Darius and Lance, but none of the evidence could conclusively point to the killer. During this time, Zora Matthews, consumed by jealousy and anxiety, was on the verge of a breakdown. She spent her days alone, locking herself away at home and avoiding contact with others. Scenes from her life with Aisha, their last conversations, looks and feelings, constantly replayed in her mind. Zora couldn't forget that fateful day, and the more time passed, the stronger her sense of guilt became. Her mind was filled with dark images, and it felt as though Aisha was haunting her. On this day, unable to bear the tension any longer, Zora decided to do what she had been putting off for too long. She went to the Denver police station and requested a meeting with Detective Cale Brown. The meeting began with a heavy silence. Zora nervously fidgeted with her purse, sitting across from the detective. Her eyes were filled with tears and her face showed deep despair. "I can't hide this anymore," she whispered as Brown looked at her, waiting. "I need to tell you what happened that day." Detective Brown, sensing the gravity of the moment, gave her time to gather her thoughts. "Tell me what happened," Brown said gently, holding a notepad in his hands. Zora began recounting that fateful day when she decided to confront Aisha once and for all. That day, Zora was overwhelmed with jealousy and anger. She knew something was going on between Aisha and Darius, even though Darius denied it. Zora's heart pounded so hard she felt her rage taking over her actions. Zora arrived at Aisha's house late in the morning. Aisha was home, alone. As soon as Zora entered, a heated argument broke out. She accused Aisha of destroying her marriage, of crossing the line, and demanded that she end things with Darius immediately. At first, Aisha laughed at the accusations, but then her expression changed. She grabbed a belt lying on the chair and, in a fit of anger, tried to strike Zora with it. "I didn't mean to kill her," Zora said quietly, tears streaming down her cheeks. "It happened by accident. She attacked me first, and I was just trying to defend myself." During the struggle, Zora grabbed Aisha by the neck. In a moment of panic, she squeezed harder than she realized, not understanding what was happening. Aisha collapsed to the floor, and everything went silent. Zora told the detective that when she realized what she had done, she was consumed by horror. Her hands shook and her breathing became heavy. She tried to revive Aisha, but it was too late. In a full-blown panic, Zora didn't know what to do. The first thing that came to mind was to call Darius. He arrived immediately, saw her state, in Aisha's body. Zora explained what had happened, and Darius decided the best course of action was to hide what had occurred to avoid destroying their lives. Together, they moved Aisha's body into the car and drove to the swamps on the outskirts of the city. Zora continued her confession, detailing how she and Darius tried to cover up the crime. She described in full how they drove to an isolated area, submerged Aisha's body in the swamp, and attempted to erase all traces of their presence. "I thought it was over, that everything would be hidden," Zora whispered, "but I couldn't live with it. Every day I saw her face. Every day she was with me." Detective Brown listened intently, jotting down every word. But he had a feeling that something in this story wasn't fully told. He noticed that Zora frequently mentioned not only the fear of being caught, but also the feeling that someone had been watching them. "Did anything else happen that day?" Brown asked, noticing her hesitation. Zora froze for a moment, her face paling. A shocking twist became clear when Zora admitted that, as she and Darius were hiding the body, she saw a car on the road. It was Lance Milton's car. She didn't know how he had ended up there, but looking back, she realized he might have seen everything. This revelation stunned Detective Brown. Lance Milton, who was already suspected of being involved with Aisha and potentially her death, could have been a witness or even an accomplice to the crime. Zora revealed that Lance had threatened her a few days later. He sent her anonymous messages hinting that he knew the truth about what had happened to Aisha. At the time, she dismissed it, thinking her paranoia was growing. but now it all made sense. Lance had been blackmailing them, using the murder as leverage. Detective Brown realized that this case had just become even more complicated. Lance Milton could have been involved in the events of that day. He might not have only been a witness, but could have delivered the fatal blow. This possibility explained why Zora had decided to take all the blame. She was in shock and couldn't remember all the details of what had happened. The trial of Zora Matthews became one of the most high-profile cases in Denver in recent years. The courtroom was packed with journalists, friends, and family members of everyone involved in the tragedy. The prosecution was determined to prove that Aisha King's murder was carefully planned, not accidental, as Zora claimed. Meanwhile, the defense argued that her actions were driven by self-defense and emotional breakdown. From the start, it was clear that this trial would be anything but straightforward. Details of the affair, double lives, and manipulations surfaced one after another, shocking everyone present. The first days of the trial focused on the relationships between Zora, Darius, and Asia. The prosecution began presenting evidence that Zora had known about her husband's affair with Asia long before the day of the murder. Their main charge was built on the testimony of Zora's friend, with whom she had shared her suspicions months before the tragedy. The prosecutor argued that this proved Zora had been planning the crime, waiting for the right moment. The prosecution also presented witness statements from neighbors who claimed to have seen Asia and Darius together at their house in Zora's absence. Testimonies underscored the growing tension between Zora. At this stage, the trial shifted focus to Aisha King and her secret life. Bank transfers and financial documents revealed that she had been living a double life. Beyond her affair with Darius, Aisha was involved in a series of illegal real estate deals and fraudulent operations with Lance Milton. The defense tried to shift the focus from Zora to Aisha, portraying the latter as a manipulator who played complex games with those around her. Aisha used Lance for her criminal deals and manipulated Darius, drawing him into the affair for her own gain. On this day, Darius Matthews took the stand. His testimony became one of the most intense moments of the trial. The prosecution asked tough questions about his relationship with Aisha, and while Darius admitted his guilt in hiding the body, he continued to insist that he knew nothing of her criminal activities. Darius tried to explain that Aisha had deceived him, using his feelings to gain access to his contacts and financial resources. He recounted how Asia had threatened him if he didn't leave Zora, and how, in the last weeks, their relationship had grown extremely tense. The prosecution, however, focused on the fact that Darius had helped Zora hide the body, knowing about the crime. This showed that while he might have been a victim of manipulation, he was still an active participant in the cover-up. The next key moment of the trial was Lance Milton's testimony. His involvement added a new layer of complexity to the case. The prosecutor questioned him about his relationship with Aisha and the events that took place on the day of her death. Lance denied any involvement in the murder, but under pressure, he admitted to following Asia and Darius that day. This confession shocked everyone. Lance admitted to seeing Zora leaving Aisha's house that day, and that he followed them to the swamps. However, he claimed he hadn't witnessed the actual murder. He arrived at the scene after Aisha was already dead and chose not to intervene. This twist increased the tension in the courtroom. Now the question arose, had Lance been involved in covering up the murder? Or had he been blackmailing Zora and Darius, using his knowledge to his advantage? As the trial progressed, the defense focused on Zora's psychological state at the time of the murder. They presented evidence that Aisha had been manipulating her for months, provoking jealousy and hatred. The defense attorney argued that Zora had been under prolonged psychological pressure, leading to her emotional breakdown. Psychological experts confirmed that Zora suffered from post-traumatic stress, triggered by Aisha's manipulations and her husband's infidelity. This explained her actions on the day of the murder as a reaction to years of accumulated tension. The closing arguments became the trial's climax. The prosecutor emphasized that Zora had deliberately hidden her suspicions and had been planning her revenge. He argued that the murder wasn't spontaneous but the result of accumulated hatred and a well-thought-out plan. The defense, however, highlighted that Asia had been the true manipulator who had ruined Zora's life. The defense lawyer insisted that the crime had been an act of self-defense and that Zora deserved leniency given her mental state and the circumstances. The trial ended, but the question of who the true villain in this story was remained open. Zora, Darius, and Lance had all been drawn into a complex web orchestrated by Asia, whose manipulations and criminal ties had destroyed the lives of everyone involved. After months of investigation, countless interrogations, and a tense courtroom drama, the case of Asia King's murder reached its final stage. Yet the questions raised during the investigation were never fully answered. Detective Cale Brown, who had overseen the case from the start, felt that the answers they had found were incomplete. Under the weight of doubts, the case was closed, but there were still unresolved mysteries. After the trial, Zora Matthews was convicted of involuntary manslaughter, though her sentence was reduced, taking into account her mental state at the time of the crime. She received a prison term of several years, and her role in hiding evidence alongside Darius added to her guilt. However, the court was unable to prove her direct involvement in premeditated murder. Darius was convicted of aiding in the cover-up and obstructing justice. He received a suspended sentence, but his career and marriage were completely destroyed. He continued to insist that he hadn't killed Asia, but admitted his guilt in helping Zora dispose of the body. But questions about Lance Milton remained unanswered. Despite his involvement in financial schemes with Asia, his alibi could not be fully confirmed, but neither could his guilt in the murder be proven. His role in the case remained ambiguous. Detective Brown, despite the case's official closure, continued to wonder, who had dealt the fatal blow? The evidence was conflicting. On one hand, Zora had confessed to the killing, although she claimed self-defense. On the other hand, Lance had been the last person seen near the crime scene. Phone records and witness statements suggested that he might have been more deeply involved than anyone had realized. Detective Brown decided to re-examine some of the evidence. He returned to the swamps where Aisha's body had been found. This place had become a symbol of all the dark and unsolved aspects surrounding the case. The swamps, with their stale smell, damp mud, and sinking objects, became a metaphor for all the secrets that had been buried in this case. The evidence, like the truth, was difficult to uncover, as if it was buried beneath layers of mud and water. The police conducted another analysis of the soil found on Lance's shoes and discovered that it matched the area near the swamps. This meant that Lance had indeed been there on the day of the murder, but why he was there and what role he played remained unclear. Meanwhile, the media continued to discuss the case's details. Journalists and experts speculated on who had really killed Asia King. Was it Zora, driven to desperation by jealousy and manipulation? Or Lance, who might have acted out of jealousy or to protect his criminal interests? The details that surfaced only added more intrigue. In some of Lance's recovered messages, there were hints that he had been blackmailing Asia or using her for his shady deals. Phone call records showed threats where he warned her not to cross the line. But Lance never confessed to his involvement in the murder, and no direct evidence was found against him. Brown understood that the answers to all these questions might remain buried in the swamp, just like Aisha's body. The truth had been obscured by layers of lies, manipulation, and secrets. Every participant in this story, Zora, Darius, Lance, had played their role, but no one could definitively prove who had delivered the fatal blow. The final day of the investigation was filled with a sense of unresolved tension. In the conclusion of this story, many unclear moments remained, leaving both the audience and investigators questioning. Who was the real killer? Detective Brown returned to the swamps one last time before officially closing the case. Standing on the edge of the muddy water, he looked at the dark, murky swamp. The swamps had become a symbol of all the secrets in this case, secrets that might never surface. The death of Asia King remained a mystery. Brown left the crime scene, leaving behind the feeling that the swamps still held the answers to the questions that could never be fully revealed.